Curt Weiler of the Osceola, very, very glad to get to sit down over Zoom, over StreamYard with David Hale of ESPN, steering into the skid a bit with your Chiron there, David. We'll get into some realignment stuff at the end, but more. I mean, I did this last year with you when I was at a different job, and I know you do your. I really enjoy your ACC positional rankings. I think last year, I don't think either of us thought Florida State was going to kind of be where it was, and yet we saw the season it had. I don't think many people saw that coming. And now this year, I mean, going through your rankings, I think aside from special teams, which is kind of its own thing, Florida State was first or second every one of your positional rankings. I mean, I know you on Twitter this week called Mike Norvell a magician, I guess. What can you say about, I mean, what he's done, how he has transformed this roster kind of from your conference-wide perspective?
I mean, it's pretty breathtaking because so I put that out on Twitter yesterday, and of course the backlash from Clemson fans and other teams is, you just did it through the portal, no big deal. Well, like if it was that easy, wouldn't everyone be doing it? And the fact of the matter is that the portal is part of life in college football now, and he embraced it sooner and better than pretty much anyone else. I mean, look, this is in no way a Willie Taggart apologist situation here, but had he taken this job in 2018, it would have been harder because you couldn't rebuild the roster quite as quickly as he has. But it doesn't change the fact that he looked at where the landscape was and said, here's where we need to get to. And not only has he not really missed on transfer guys, but he's brought in guys that, I mean, you can make a very valid case that Jermaine Johnson was the linchpin of changing the mentality of Florida State from a bunch of guys who were used to losing to a bunch of guys who didn't want to lose anymore. You can make a very good argument that although he was not technically his transfer, Jordan Travis would have been playing wide receiver at a D3 school probably if it had been up to other coaches. That Mike Norvell salvaged Jordan Travis, and Jordan's ascendance has mirrored Florida State's in so many ways. And then, I mean, you just look at where this team is: Johnny Wilson and Jared Verse, and there's just the impact guys have continually been guys that he has found in the transfer portal who were not freaking superstars out of the transfer, like guys that he found and identified the talent. I mean, it's been a very Moneyball approach to the transfer portal. Although I don't know, are we allowed to talk about Michael Lewis books anymore, or are all those not facts anymore? I don't know.
Tough week. It's a tough week.
But the point is that the way he has done it, again, would it have worked out the same 10 years ago? No, it wouldn't. It would have, but by design, it was much harder to do. I think the way that he has done it is remarkable, though, because he has shown a very deft touch for identifying the strengths and weaknesses of his roster, finding gems in the portal to address those weaknesses, and not just guys who have talent, but guys who have come in and made the locker room better. Because as bad as the talent was on the field 3 or 4 years ago, oh dear God, the locker room was even worse. So, I mean, the turnaround on that side is, I mean, you can make the argument that trying to turn around a locker room through the portal is actually harder than doing it through recruiting. So in some ways, the job that he's done is more impressive that way.
Yeah, it's funny. Leading into what I was going to talk about next, I think there's some comments from Lane Kiffin when he was at SEC Kickoff, I think talking to Marty and McGee about kind of his thoughts on, and obviously he's another guy. He was kind of maybe the early portal king, and I think Mike Norvell's maybe taken that crown from him long term because his hit rate's been higher. And I mean, I can tell you, being out there at practice, the hit rate's high again. They have hit again at a high rate. But Lane had some comments about kind of like the state of college football with the portal, with NIL and all have hurt the culture of college football programs. And I think Mike's not an argumentative guy, but he would definitely disagree with that. I think it's about finding the right guys. But the talent thing is one thing, but you're right. I mean, what he does where guys who are important quickly become important culture pieces and that don't deter the culture, but kind of improve it somehow, it is remarkable.
Yeah, and I mean, look, I don't necessarily think that Lane is wrong in a big picture sense. I mean, I think that points more to how good Mike Norvell has been at doing this, because it can go haywire. I mean, I've talked to a number of coaches who have essentially said, like, look, the idea about how you build culture in your locker room has had to change by necessity. You have some coaches like Dabo who are going to hold tight to the old way of doing things. And I'm not saying that's wrong for Clemson, but it is addressing, I think, what Lane is talking about. You've had some coaches who have done, I think, a very sort of surgical job of, I'm going to take 2 or 3 guys that I need to help me, but these are not going to be locker room guys. They're not the guys to win or lose games for us Monday through Friday. They're the guys that we need on Saturday. I think Mike Norvell is the exception to the rule in a lot of senses, that he has found the guys that have made the team better 7 days a week, not just on Saturday.
We talked about Jordan, and I feel like that's where this conversation has to start. I mean, you've been on the Florida State, you've been covering the ACC, been around. I mean, where does his, kind of transformation stack up? He's a guy who I know nearly walked away from football 3 years ago, was considering maybe I should be a wide receiver, like you mentioned. And then, the belief from Mike Norvell and Kenny Dillingham and just what they've done with him to turn him into now, a guy who led a 10-win team, who's kind of in the front portion of the Heisman race going into the preseason, feels like a trendy pick in that regard entering the season.
Yeah, it's funny because, when I talked to Kenny about Jordan's development, and I was like, well, what did you do? And he's like, honestly, we didn't change much on him. We just got him to buy into the fact that he's good. But he has improved by leaps and bounds too. It's a nice story to say, guy didn't believe in himself. We patted him on the back enough until he got good. And there's a lot of truth to that. But he is such a better player today than he was 3 or 4 years ago too. And that's on him. That's on him, the work that he has put in. There's just not part of it is that there's not a lot of stories like his, period. It is unique to this day and age of college football. And, the reason that I was talking to Kenny about him is because I did this story on what does it even mean to develop a quarterback in this day and age? Because if you're a team and you don't have a quarterback, you go get one. And if you're a quarterback on a team who's not getting the playing time that you want, you leave and go somewhere else. The odds of sort of finding a guy by necessity who was the diamond in the rough, how many times are we going to see this anymore at the same school? So, look, you're going to have your guys like, Bailey Zappi or whatever, who came out of nowhere from FCS or whatever. But to have a guy who's 4th on your depth chart who suddenly becomes a star, I just don't know if we'll ever see it again, which is what makes the story so unique now. But also just to kind of know who Jordan is and the mentality that he has and where he came from to where he is now, and the fact that there is no place he wanted to do it more than Florida State. It's just such a wonderful, amid all of the, the stuff that Lane Kiffin's talking about and all of the challenging new dynamics of college football, Jordan Travis is the absolute feel-good story of the year, in my opinion.
Perhaps the only transformation more drastic than his at Florida State is on the offensive line. That's a unit. It's now you're going into the year, I think, but you said best offensive line in the ACC, and we knew what they were in 2018-19, even really trailing back to the end of Jimbo's tenure. It was falling off before Jimbo left town for sure under Rick Trickett. Watching that, and seeing what Alec Atkinson does, where now I think they feel good about having maybe 8 or 9 guys there where, you're going to have some attrition there over the course of the season. It's going to happen. And I know they didn't have the preseason All-ACC guy. Some of that's, I think, because we don't entirely know how that's going to sort out. But just what can you say about that unit and watching how far it's come from the dreadful days?
Yeah, it's hard to sort of put into context how bad it was. I remember when Dave Clawson first got the job at Wake Forest, I was sitting in his office in 2014 and asking him, I think they had one returning skill player. They had nothing to work with. And I remember asking him about his O-line, and he was like, I have seen high school offensive lines better than what we're going to be able to put out there this year. And then I remember 4 or 5 years later watching Florida State and being like, Jesus, this is worse than what he was just talking about back then. It was an absolute train wreck. And so, look, Alex Atkins is really damn good at his job. And the bad news for Florida State is there's a ticking clock on how long you can hang on to him because he's head coaching material, as he should be. But the talent acquisition, the coaching, the strength training, the technical development, all of this stuff has coalesced. This wasn't a one-step job. This wasn't go out, and find 5 dudes in the portal who can play. Like, this has been a little of everything. And I mean, you want to ask me, like, what is the biggest difference in Florida State now versus 3 years ago? You go out to practice now, and there's 10, 12, 15 dudes. Like, not all of them are ready to go out there and play at the highest of levels today, but they've got like the body type that they look like guys who should be playing for a championship team on the O-line. And it's just been a while since we've seen that. And, again, you talk about guys who he got in the portal that have made a big, like Dylan Gibbons is a great example of a guy who turned out to be a really good player, but also was such a foundational element of changing the dynamic on that offensive line too. I mean, they've just made every right step in terms of how they've built it. Like, it has been built. It hasn't been wave a magic wand, snap your fingers, and it's done. It has been built, and it has been built in a way that is I think really remarkable.
The climb has definitely been on display there. It's Mike Norvell's mantra, and it's definitely, but really throughout the entire offense to the point now. I mean, they bring back Trey Benson. They bring back Johnny Wilson and a few other guys. They add a guy like Keon Coleman. They add what they do in the tight end room. I mean, frankly, I ask you, and I don't know. I mean, how would you try and stop this offense? Because it does truly feel like an offense where if you try and commit too hard to one, they can beat you with the other. They're so versatile where we have struggled to come up with a way to kind of stop it, frankly, minus self-inflicted mistakes.
Yeah, and I mean, look, you never 100% know going into a year how I mean, look, the number one way you stop it is see if Jordan Travis gets hurt, because that makes a big difference. But look, I think the pass protection struggled at times last year, and I think you showed last year you could disrupt Jordan at times. He got a lot better at that as the year went along, and the O-line is much better prepared to deal with that this year. I mean, I think people forget because they won 10 games, like they were playing kind of with one hand tied behind their back on the O-line for much of last year due to injuries and attrition. So, I mean, you could look at the film from last year and say that's the way to attack it, but I don't know if that's even necessarily true this year. I would look and say, like, I think the interior D-line struggled at times last year, particularly against the run. Maybe you try and run it down their throat and keep the offense off the field as much as possible. But I don't know, Fabian Lovett's healthy. Fisk looks like a really damn good player. Like, is that even true anymore? Like, this is, again, look, I think it is hard for me. I always have said it is hard for me to say we're definitely, like, on paper in August, and what we actually see by November is not always, in fact, not often aligned. But I've talked to plenty of coaches around the league who have said, like, that's a really freaking good football team. They're really good and deep in a lot of places. I don't think the hype is overblown. Like, they could go out and start 2-2. That's entirely reasonable. But I don't think that will mean that the hype was overblown. Like, this is a very talented – I'll be shocked. I'll put it this way. Shocked if they go out there and lose in any sort of an embarrassing way in both of those games. Like, Clemson and LSU are 2 top 10 teams too. Like, those should be good matchups. I don't think Florida State is going to dramatically out-talent either of those teams. But however this turns out, I don't think that the hype was incorrect, because Florida State belongs in those conversations now.
I think the defense you brought up is kind of a question. There were the run defense problems last year. I know the pass defense was, I think, statistically best in the ACC at yards per a game, I think maybe allowed, but like that's not the best metric. I think FSU fans would tell you it wasn't the best secondary in the ACC, even what the numbers say. What do you make of this defense? I mean, with what they've brought back, some guys that they probably didn't expect to bring back, and with what they've added, guys like Fentrell Cypress, who I know we're aware of at Virginia, and just other pieces.
Yeah, I mean, the pieces that have come in have been impressive, and I think one of the bigger things is that there's some depth there too. I mean, certainly the NCAA didn't do them any favors on one position group, but I think they can afford. I mean, this when the D line, when Verse didn't play healthy for the bulk of last year, Fabian Lovett wasn't healthy for the bulk of last year. They were playing a little bit with one hand tied behind their back in their front 6 or 7 or whatever we call it these days. And they didn't have the depth to withstand that. I think they're much better prepared for that this year, I think, is one of the biggest differences. And, look, I mean, it's, again, I think defense, I struggle with how to rate a defense in general statistically, because the more successful your offense is, sometimes the more challenging it is for your defense. So some of those numbers to me don't speak to much of anything other than the offense just scored in 2 plays, so now the defense is right back on the field and it's a challenge. Again, that's where I think depth comes in, and to me, on the defensive side of the ball, I mean, I don't know that the ones are like this night and day difference from last year, and as you noted, a lot of them are the same guys. But I think there's depth to the team on defense this year that will allow them to sort of weather some of those storms as the season gets tougher and guys get dinged up.
I guess you talked about it, and it's fair to bring up the variables that can happen over the course of a season. Obviously, things have to break right. I mean, that 2013 team, as good as they were, had a lot of injury luck in their favor, and a lot of things break their way. What do you think this team's ceiling could be? I mean, ACC title, more than that potentially? I mean, do you think there's a world where they can play with the big boys this year?
I am sort of the opinion that unless there's a complete train wreck at the quarterback position, that Georgia is the best team in college football, and I'm not really going to back off of that. But that next tier is, I don't know, I think you can make a valid case for probably 7 or 8 teams. And I think Florida State, talent-wise, depth chart-wise, belongs in that conversation. Now, I mean, I've picked Clemson to win the ACC almost exclusively because I've seen them do it. They did it last year. They have been to the playoff relatively recently. I know who they recruit. I know what they're all about. And so it's easier to say when you've seen it happen. And it's been a while since we've seen it happen at that level for Florida State. And for as good as last year was, they lost to Wake Forest. They lost a game they absolutely had no business losing to NC State. And aside from a fourth quarter comeback to make things interesting, they got whipped for a good part of the game against a Clemson team that I think most Clemson fans would tell you is probably not as good as they're expecting that team to be this year. The challenge isn't small. Like, it's a big challenge ahead of them. And I don't think anybody should be like disappointed if it's a 10-3 season again this year. Like, it could be that. But where's the ceiling? Like, to me, there's absolutely, if TCU played the championship game last year, there's absolutely no reason to suggest that Florida State can't do that this year.
And I guess you talked to, I mean, all the coaches across the conference, I'm sure at multiple levels of the coaching staff, all that. I'm curious what the FSU Clemson thing of it all. I mean, obviously people expect them to play twice. Those are kind of the 2 runaways. What have you heard any feedback about maybe them weighing in on what they think of that competition there?
Yeah. I've talked to Dabo and I've explicitly asked him, like, what do you think about, the Florida State hype train this year? I think it's a little bit funny because Mike Norvell has really embraced the hype. To his credit, in my mind, is like, man, if you want to be the best, you got to beat the best. Let's embrace this type of thing. Dabo has always wanted to play the underdog, nobody respects us card. And we in the media have largely given them both what they wanted, I think, which is fine. It's funny. There's some less than fantastic reporters maybe that attend Clemson press conferences from time to time.
No.
And yeah, I know, shocking, right? So I was down there the other day and some guy asked, I'm going to try to remember the question, but something of, yeah, coach, you look at teams like Miami and USC and LSU, like, you think those are going to be a big challenge for you? Or no, South Carolina, what did he say? It was Miami. Oh, North Carolina. Anyway, so Dabo's like, well, hold on a second. When you say USC, do you mean South Carolina? And these guys say, oh, yeah, South Carolina. I'm like, we've already lost the thread here if we're referring to South Carolina as USC. But neither here nor there. But the first thing Dabo says is, well, I noticed you didn't mention Florida State. So, look, they've got Dabo's attention at the very least, and rightfully so. And look, we are in a very ugly time in the ACC. I don't think it's going to get less ugly in the near future. But for the short term, if God willing, we can just put aside realignment stuff while these guys are out on the field playing football, this is the best thing that's happened to the ACC in years, that these 2 teams are seem to be both every bit as good as people are talking about them being, that they actually have 2 heavyweights that can trade punches and, as you noted, potentially see each other twice.
I'm curious before we move on, your thoughts on the rest of the ACC. I don't know. I mean, you talked, I guess you personally have Clemson ahead of Florida State, and obviously Clemson picked as the favorite. I think that's understandable in terms of people want to see Florida State do it. They haven't beaten Clemson since 2014. I'm curious, do you have, I guess, who is your maybe a team that you think will surprise people? What do you think of Miami going into Crystal Ball year 2? I'm sure that's something Florida State fans are anxious to hear what you think on the matter.
Well, I've been on the hype train for Pitt as the third best team in the league. I would point out to people that they've won 20 games over the last 2 years. Most folks may not remember it, but Pat Narduzzi's done a real good job of churning out talent, winning football games. Their defense is good every year. They get after it up front. They're a team that is going to stay in games. And they were real bad in the quarterback situation last year. I think Phil Dracovic is a very good fit for them. I don't know if he can go and turn in like a Kenny Pickett type year, but I think he's going to be a really darn good fit for them. And they've got some pieces around them. It's not a sexy team, but that's a team to me that is not going to beat itself and is going to stay in every game, and it's going to be a real challenge for everybody that they face. So that has sort of been the default number 3 team to me. Look, you can go up and down the rest of the league and make a lot of cases for a lot of teams. I mean, any year in which people aren't expecting big things from NC State is the year NC State tends to play really good football. And, Brennan Armstrong and Robert and I back together, that should be interesting. Drake May is probably the best player in the league and may well be the number 1 overall draft pick next year. I don't know how much he's got around him. The defense looked like a complete train wreck last year. They don't have to be a lot better for them to be a pretty good team, though. And then, you mentioned Miami. I always say my default off-season evaluation of teams, that my sort of like pass-fail is, do you have a quarterback, an O-line, and a D-line? Like, are you good at the line of scrimmage, and do you have a guy who you can trust to play quarterback? I think Miami has those things. I think they're going to be real good on the O-line. I think, at least if they stay relatively healthy, real good on the D-line. I'm still a Tyler Van Dyke fan, despite what happened last year. I think that was just a massive failure of the coaching staff. How much do they have around them? I don't know, because linebacker to me is a problem. Aside from Kitchens, it's not a great secondary. They've got virtually nothing proven at the skill positions. Those are big concerns. But I traditionally say, like, if you're going to be in the conversation, that conversation starts with line of scrimmage and quarterback. And I feel okay about Miami at those spots.
I think Florida State fans would agree with you on Pitt. I think I kind of, after the big 2, I think that's the third one they're circling of, like, that is a trap game if we're in a 1-loss situation or a 2-loss situation, wherever we are, where, I mean, that's the next one you look at, especially coming off a trip to Wake Forest the week before. We have to touch on realignment a little bit while I got you here. Obviously, August 15th deadline is passed. Florida State will be in the ACC in 2024. 2025 remains a question. In some ways, I would agree with you and call myself a realignment denier, in that I wish we could just keep things the way they are. I mean, I think you're seeing college football, unfortunately, trend towards being a much more of a NFL minor league, and I don't think that's what anybody particularly likes about the sport. There will be some perks that come out of it, but you'll feel for a lot of fan bases and programs that get left behind. I mean, I think of you more as a realignment pragmatist, a realignment realist there. Yeah, I mean, you've never said you understand why Florida State wants to get out. You've just always laid out why that is harder than some people would like to think it is.
Yeah, I mean, this is not waving a magic wand to make it happen. It is not simply about making a decision that we're going to go. I think Florida State is going to leave, probably sooner than later. It will not be 2036. It won't be 2030. Obviously, it won't be 2024. I mean, they may make the decision about 2025 or 2026. I'm not sure they're going to be able to do it by then, because there is no world in which this is not a protracted, ugly, expensive legal battle. Because if they want out of the grant of rights, there may be a path out of it. There very well may be. And I'm quite certain that if you pay a lawyer enough money, they will tell you there is. But it's never been, we've never seen a court case where a grant of rights has been put on trial, basically. There is no precedent here. We don't know. I know smart people wrote the grant of rights to try and prevent exactly this from happening. And Florida State was a part of those conversations, mind you. So the ACC, I think there is a general understanding that, like, there is not a world in which Clemson and Florida State are here forever. It's just not. But there is a world in which the ACC moves on in much the same way the Big 12 has. And I think if you're in the ACC right now, you are looking at the Big 12 and the Pac-12, and you're saying there's a future where we can be one of these, and there's a future where we can be the other, and we know exactly which direction we would like to go in. And Frankly, I think philosophically, there are a lot more alignment between the ACC and the Pac-12 in terms of what the presidents think and how they operate, and that's problematic for the league's future. But part of making all of this work is making sure that if Florida State and Clemson are leaving, you are getting every last penny you can before they go. And so that why I say, like, there's not even necessarily, we can talk dollar figures. Like, there is theoretically a dollar figure that would buy you out of the grant of rights, whatever that is. People have talked about $500 million. I think that's a ludicrous amount of money for anybody to spend, because you would not be making back what you are getting at. Like, it doesn't, the balance sheet doesn't work out on that. But even if that's the number, it doesn't preclude a judge from saying, like, you can buy your way out of the league. It's a $120 million exit fee. That's right there in your contract. You don't have rights to broadcast your games. Like, or you can broadcast them, and every dime that comes from that broadcast goes to the ACC, not to whatever league you're going to. And that's really problematic too. You have to extricate yourself from this legal quagmire. And look, that's not a let's go get married down at the courthouse type of legal situation. This is a thing that is going to probably take years and millions of dollars to litigate. And so that's why I say, like, it's not, if it was that simple, Florida State probably would have done it by now, as would Clemson. It is an ugly, ugly, ugly situation that they're going to walk into. But when you start adding up all the numbers and looking at balance sheets and seeing where things are going, it might be the least ugly of all of your ugly alternatives, which is, I think, where we're at right now. And I think that's, to Mike Alford's credit, is one of the reasons he has been so outspoken about trying to find any other avenue to make things work, because nobody wants this. It is not going to be fun to go through. It's like a divorce. Like, you got to go through every marriage counseling and, second honeymoon and whatever the hell else you can do to try to save the marriage before you say, all right, let me put half my assets up for grabs. Like, that's where things are.
Well, and in the meantime, it seems like Florida State it feels like they are trying to be as bold as they are, both because, I mean, they can't work in the dark of night, because that's not how their situation works, like it did for Oklahoma, for Texas, for the California schools and those who left the Pac-12. But also, I mean, I think it feels like they know that, at least for the moment, they're stuck, and so they're trying to do something more than the success initiatives. I know your colleague Andrea Adelson at ESPN wrote a story about kind of the ACC side of what the last few weeks have been like. It doesn't seem like there's any real traction made on an uneven revenue split, which I think is what Florida State would love in the meantime.
Yeah, and I think the way that you phrased the question sort of answers itself. And I don't argue with Michael Alford or FSU's approach to this, like, rattle some cages and see what happens. I mean, I think there's a genuine thought that chaos breeds opportunity in this situation. The flip side, though, is that if you're Pitt or Louisville or Duke or whomever else would have to go along with a plan for unequal revenue distribution based on TV ratings or whatever, you're going to say, what the hell am I doing this for? Because they're leaving either way. We're just delaying the inevitable, and they're still going to leave. And I've heard that from numerous ADs of, like, I hear what Michael Alford's saying, but there's no incentive for us to do that if they're not going to stick around and make sure that our league is something that can survive for the long term.
I think that's the truth of the situation right now. I think many people agree it's a matter of when it happens, not if. I mean, Drew Weatherford himself said that on the board of trustees meeting, but for the time being, at least, you get to keep Florida State in your ACC network, David. I'm sure you're happy about keeping it.
I told him I'm following y'all wherever you go, so it doesn't really matter. It does not matter to me. In fact, I've been to Amelia Island a bunch. I'll go down to Destin for whatever. If they want to go out to Vegas for some stuff after they get to the Big Ten, I'm all for this. I have no downside to this whatsoever. I would love to stop talking about it for 10 minutes so I can think about actual football or sleep.
You can't quit FSU Twitter. You can't quit FSU Twitter, dude. That's what I'm learning from this. Yeah. I appreciate you.
Who else would put me in my place and tell me how terrible I am? I might go through life happy. I wouldn't want that.
Hey, I think they will like. I think our listeners, our viewers, our readers will like what you had to say here, because I think it's the truth of the situation, and I think. But no, I always appreciate you taking the time, David. I won't take any more of it because I know how valuable it is this time of year. Thank God we'll have football to actually discuss soon instead of discussing realignment, because I'd much rather talk about football games as well. But I greatly appreciate the time as always.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for doing it. We'll do it again to kick off SEC season.
Oh, you know it. 2025.